The long trestle tables behind the Harlow Creek Church had been dressed since noon, with the valley's best linen and its good china, plate set beside plate in the order that had governed every supper that congregation had held for as long as anyone could remember. And by the time Sun Hee Ri came up the path from the road, with both arms wrapped around a covered clay crock, still faintly warm from 2 days of grinding chile and salting cabbage, and packing it tight beneath its cloth, every place at every table already belonged to somebody whose name the women setting them had known since birth. She found the gap only by counting, walking the length of both tables twice with the crock growing heavier in her arms, because there was no place laid for her at either one. No chair pulled back, no fork set crosswise on a folded napkin, the way the rest of the valley's wives and widows had been given. Only a stretch of bare cloth between the Hendersons' plates and the Kesslers', where a 10th chair might once have gone, and now plainly would not. She heard it before she saw who had said it. A voice pitched exactly loud enough to carry to her, and exactly soft enough that no one nearby would later admit to hearing it, plainly remarking to a companion that the foreign wife could eat after, once the families had had their turn, as though the order of a supper line were a fact of nature, rather than a decision somebody in that churchyard had made an hour before Sun Hee ever came up the path. She did not set the crock down on the ground, and she did not carry it back home the way some smaller, more easily beaten version of herself might have, in that first raw minute, been tempted to. She walked instead to the very gap she had just finished measuring with her own eyes, and she set the crock down in the empty space where her own plate should have been, arranging it as carefully as she would have arranged it at her own table. And then she turned and walked back down the churchyard path alone, past every bench and every bowed, unmeeting pair of eyes, without once looking back to see whether anyone reached for a serving spoon. Nobody did. The crock sat exactly where she had left it, through the singing and the second grace and the long, slow business of pie. Its lid never lifted, its contents never so much as glanced at twice, until a boy clearing tables after dark finally lifted it away, along with the empty bowls nobody had claimed either, uncertain, in that moment, exactly where a crock nobody wanted was supposed to go. What none of the families walking home that evening yet knew, satisfied with a supper that had gone, by their own measure, entirely according to plan, was that the following Sunday, for the first time in 11 years of regular attendance, the Ashford pew at the front of that same church would sit completely empty, and that no one who asked Caleb Ashford why would ever get a plain answer out of him. 3 miles out at the Ashford spread, the news of the empty pew reached Caleb before most of Harlow Creek had even finished its own Sunday dinner, carried out by a ranch hand who had heard it secondhand at the Mercantile, and repeated it back to his employer with the particular relish small towns reserve for anything resembling a scandal involving a man as steady and as silent as Caleb Ashford had been for 11 straight years. Caleb only said that he supposed he'd sleep in the following Sunday too, and went back to mending a section of fence that did not, by any close inspection, actually need mending, working at it with a concentration that discouraged further questions from a hand who had learned, over 3 years in his employ, exactly which of his employer's silences were worth pushing against and which were not. Reverend Josiah Cole rode out himself 2 Sundays later, unable to let a full month pass without at least inquiring after the largest tithing family remaining on his rolls, and found Caleb civil enough over coffee on the porch, willing to discuss cattle prices and the state of the eastern fence line at some length, but entirely unwilling to discuss church, deflecting the question twice with the practiced ease of a man who had clearly been expecting it and had already decided exactly how much of an answer he intended to give. Pressed a 3rd time, gently, Caleb finally said only that a man ought to be able to sit down to a supper without wondering first whether a place had actually been set for him, and that he reckoned he'd wait until he was satisfied. The answer to that question applied to everyone in the valley equally, not merely to men like himself who arrived already carrying the right name and the right amount of cattle. The Reverend, who had heard some version of the churchyard supper by then, from at least 4 different sources, none of them entirely in agreement on the particulars, chose not to press further, recognizing in Caleb's tone the specific finality of a man who had said everything he intended to say on a subject, and would not be moved by a second visit either. Word of the exchange spread through Harlow Creek faster than the Reverend himself likely intended, and within the week, half the valley understood, without anyone stating it outright, exactly whose absent plate Caleb Ashford's absent pew was meant to answer. A fact that cost him, over the following months, 2 separate dinner invitations from families with unmarried daughters, a noticeably cooler reception at the Mercantile from women who had once competed for his attention at every social, and the quiet, needling disapproval of men who had counted on his standing to lend weight to whatever the Valley's better families decided among themselves. She had not always been the widow Ree measuring bare tablecloth with her own eyes. At a church supper 3 miles from the homestead, she now worked alone. 6 years before, she had been Soon-hee, a merchant's second daughter in a coastal town south of Incheon, examining a photograph of a broad-shouldered laborer named Iksu Ree, who had gone to America to lay track through country he described in his letters as bigger and emptier than anything a person raised near a crowded harbor could properly imagine, and who had written home for a picture bride the way a great many men in his position did, hoping for a wife willing to cross an ocean toward a life neither of them could fully see from a photograph and a stack of careful, hopeful letters. Iksu had been patient and steady in the years they built the homestead together along Coldwater Creek, teaching her cattle and English and the particular rhythms of a country that judged newcomers first and asked questions about them only much later. And she in turn had taught him, in the small hours after the day's work was done, the preserving methods her own mother had taught her before the crossing, the salting and the packing, and the slow, patient fermenting that kept cabbage and mustard greens sound and edible clear through a winter that spoiled everything stored the ordinary way. She had thought, in those first steady years, that the method was simply a comfort from home, a private habit that made the long winters taste less like exile, and it was only in the black winter 3 years past, when an early blight took half the valley's stored harvest and left every root cellar for 20 miles smelling of rot by the new year, that she understood it as something closer to a lifeline than a comfort. Iksu had refused it longest of anyone, embarrassed even in his own kitchen by food a valley doctor had once called, within his hearing, unfit for a Christian table. And by the time his gums had begun to bleed and his joints had swollen past the point where pride could still hold him upright, the sickness that the doctor called simply winter wasting had already gone further in him than any Crock of hers could reach in time to turn back. She had buried him in the frozen ground behind the cabin with the valley's sympathy, but not, she came to understand over the following seasons, its full acceptance, and she had gone on making the Crocks anyway through every winter since, quietly, mostly for herself, occasionally trading a jar or two through the back door of Pruitt's Mercantile to families who wanted what was in them a good deal more than they wanted to be seen wanting it. What the Valley's gossip never quite settled on, trading theories about Caleb Ashford's empty pew that ranged from wounded pride to some falling out with the Reverend nobody could name precisely, was the particular private reason a bare stretch of tablecloth had struck him harder than it struck most men watching from 3 benches back. Behind the main house on the Ashford spread, past the smokehouse and the second corral, stood a small fenced plot. No ranch hand was ever asked to tend, and no visitor was ever walked past on purpose, holding a single marker cut plain from local stone and set 3 winters back, over a grave scarcely large enough to need the full length of the plot around it. Toby Ashford had been 5 years old in the black winter, a quick, sunburned boy who had followed his father across every acre of that ranch since he was old enough to sit a saddle in front of him, and he had gone down with the same winter wasting that took Iksu Ree that same hard season, the same bleeding gums and swollen joints and creeping exhaustion that Dr. Elias Marsh, working from the only medicine chest within 30 miles, had treated with tonics and bleeding and the particular helpless confidence of a man doing everything the books he owned told him to do, none of which had been enough. Caleb had sat up with the boy through the last 9 nights of that winter, without once leaving the room, holding a small pair of boots that had gone unworn since the fever first took hold. And he had heard, only afterward, secondhand and too late to matter, that a Korean widow 3 miles out kept a method of preserving greens through the winter that some folks swore kept the same sickness from taking hold in families who ate it regular, a rumor he had dismissed at the time as exactly the kind of desperate, grief-fed talk that circulates through any valley after a bad season, and that he had thought of every single day since with a bitterness he had never once spoken aloud to another living soul. He kept the boots now in the barn, on a shelf above his own saddle where his hand brushed them, without quite meaning to, most mornings, and he had understood, watching from a distance as Sun Hee-ri set her crock down in a gap at the supper table that no one had troubled to fill for her. Exactly what an empty place setting could cost a person who had no power at all to fill it herself. Because he had spent 3 winters now living inside a house that had never once managed to fill its own. Silas Pruitt kept Sun Hee-ri's jars on the same shelf behind his own counter that he kept the store's ledger and the tin where he stashed the day's silver. Not out on display among the vinegar pickles and the tin peaches where any customer might see them and ask questions he had decided, some time back, he would rather not answer on her behalf. He sold them quietly to families who asked for them by a careful roundabout phrase most of Harlow Creek had settled on, without ever quite agreeing to it out loud. Something in the crock, meaning everyone in the transaction understood exactly what stood behind the counter and exactly why nobody wanted to say her name over it. And he kept a private tally of who bought how often, noting with the particular unspoken satisfaction of a man watching his own quiet judgment, proven correct that the families who bought most regular were, without exception, the families whose children came through every winter looking strongest come spring. He had never told Sun-hee this directly, partly because the two of them rarely exchanged more than the minimum words a transaction required, and partly because he suspected, correctly, that she already understood her own trade's arithmetic better than he did, arriving every second week with a fresh delivery wrapped in cloth, and counted out in a silence that had become, over 3 years, its own kind of conversation between them. She used the coin from those sales for salt and cloth, and the occasional bolt of good wool, small comforts she allowed herself without any particular guilt, having long since stopped expecting the front door of Pruitt's Mercantile to open onto anything warmer than careful, transactional civility. What she did not yet know, carrying her empty basket back out past the shelves of goods she could not always afford to buy outright, was that the boy who had cleared the church supper tables the previous evening had, on Caleb Ashford's own quiet instruction, and against his own better judgment about getting mixed up in valley business that plainly wasn't his to mix in, carried her abandoned crock not to the shed with the rest of the leftovers, but out to the Ashford wagon instead, where it currently sat, lid still sealed, on the seat beside a man working up the nerve to figure out exactly how he meant to return it to her. He rode out to the Coldwater Creek claim 2 evenings after the supper, the crock wedged carefully in a crate lined with straw so it would not shift and crack on the ride, and he left it, the way he had learned over 11 years to leave most things he did not care to explain, propped against her gatepost rather than carried up to her door, weighted down with a fence stone so the evening wind would not tip it before she found it. He did not knock, and he had gotten as far as remounting his horse when the cabin door opened anyway. Sun-hee, having heard hooves enough times in her 3 years alone, on that claim to know the sound was worth investigating, regardless of the hour, and the two of them stood for a long, awkward moment on opposite sides of her gate, neither one having planned for the conversation now plainly required of them. She asked him, in English grown steady over 6 years, but still careful with strangers, why a man she had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in 3 years had troubled himself to ride 3 miles carrying back a crock. Nobody else in the valley had wanted to touch. He told her, plain and a little rougher than he meant it to sound, that a boy clearing tables had been about to pitch it in with the slop for the hogs, and that he'd decided, watching that happen, that whatever the valley thought it had settled at that supper table, throwing away 2 days of a woman's careful work, wasn't going to be part of the settlement while he was standing close enough to stop it. She studied him for a moment in the last of the daylight, searching his face for the particular kind of pity she had learned to recognize and brace against from 3 years of near strangers, and found instead something closer to plain, unshowy anger that did not seem to be performing itself for her benefit at all. She invited him, somewhat to her own surprise, to take the crock back inside rather than leave it standing at a gatepost a second time. And he did, and when she opened it at her own table under her own roof and set 2 spoons down without much ceremony, he tasted for the first time in 3 years, a meal that reminded him powerfully and painfully of nothing in particular, except that it was very good, and that he intended, whatever else came of the evening, to finish every bite of it. She showed him the cellar the following week, when he rode out again on the thin pretext of checking whether her fence along the north boundary needed the same repair his own had needed after the spring thaw, an excuse neither of them examined too closely since the boundary in question ran nowhere near either property. Rows of Crocks lined a shelf dug back into the cool earth beneath her cabin, each one weighted with a smooth creek stone to keep the greens submerged beneath their own brine. And she explained, patient in the particular unhurried way of someone finally allowed to speak about a skill she had spent 3 years defending, mostly in silence, how the salt drew the water out of the cabbage and the mustard greens until they sat submerged in a brine of their own making, how the crock had to breathe without ever quite opening to the air, how 3 weeks of patient waiting turned what looked to an unpracticed eye like something closer to spoilage into something that would keep a family fed and strong, clear through the worst of a Harlow Creek winter. She told him, because he asked plainly and did not flinch from the answer, that her own mother had taught her the method as a girl in a kitchen half a world away, insisting even then that a family that knew how to keep its greens through a hard season would never go hungry in the particular slow, wasting way that took the weakest first and the proudest last. She told him too, more carefully, that Iksu had come to trust it only in the final weeks of his own illness, too late by then to matter, ashamed for most of their marriage to serve guests anything that smelled, as one visiting doctor had once put it within her hearing, more like a barnyard than a Christian kitchen. Caleb said nothing for a long moment, turning a creek stone over in his own hand the way he might have turned over a piece of evidence in a case he had spent 3 years failing to properly investigate, and then told her, quiet and direct, that he had heard the same rumor about her Crocks the winter his own son died, and had dismissed it at the time as exactly the kind of grief-fed talk a hard season always produces, a decision he said he had come to regret more thoroughly than almost any other he had made in his life. Talk of Caleb Ashford's wagon parked outside the Reclaim reached Harlow Creek with the particular speed reserved for anything involving unmarried adults and an already scandalized supper table, and it arrived by the time it reached Adeline Kessler at her own kitchen table, considerably more embellished than the plain fence-checking and crock-tasting it had actually been. Adeline Kessler had organized the seating at every church supper for the better part of a decade, a task she performed with the quiet, unquestioned authority of a woman whose husband held the largest cattle contract in 3 counties. And she had been the voice, soft enough to deny and loud enough to carry, that had decided the foreign wife could eat after the families had had their turn. A decision she defended to her own husband that same week as simple common sense rather than cruelty. Since a woman who kept a barnyard smell in her kitchen, by Adeline's own account, could hardly expect a place among decent tables until she'd shown some willingness to keep a proper Christian household instead. Her husband, Warren Kessler, a man who mostly avoided disagreeing with his wife on matters he considered beneath his direct attention, said only that Caleb Ashford could keep whatever company he pleased, a response that satisfied neither of them and settled nothing. The matter came to Pruitt's Mercantile the following Saturday, when a rancher's wife made a remark within Caleb's hearing about foreign witch brew and the particular kind of man who let himself get talked into eating it, plainly fishing for the satisfaction of watching him flinch or explain himself in front of a store full of witnesses. Caleb did neither. He walked instead to the shelf behind Pruitt's counter, asked Silas Pruitt directly and at full volume for 6 jars of whatever Mrs. Ree had brought in that week, paid for them in full view of the entire store, without a flicker of the discomfort the rancher's wife had plainly been hoping to provoke, and carried them out to his wagon as unhurried as a man buying nails. Pruitt, who had spent 3 years selling those same jars in careful whispers to customers who wanted them badly enough to buy them quietly and not badly enough to buy them out loud, watched the whole exchange with an expression that suggested he was recalculating on the spot exactly how much of his own careful discretion had ever actually been necessary. It was Sun-Hee who finally asked, on an evening in early autumn when Caleb had taken to riding out often enough that neither of them any longer pretended the visits required an excuse, whether he might be willing to show her where his son was buried, having gathered by then, from small unguarded details in his conversation, roughly the shape of what that black winter had cost him. He walked her out past the smokehouse and the second corral in silence, and stood with her a long while at the small fenced plot holding Toby's marker, telling her, haltingly at first, and then with more ease than he had managed with almost anyone else in 3 years, about a boy who had followed him across every acre of that ranch from the time he could sit a saddle, about 9 nights spent holding a small pair of boots that had gone unworn since the fever took hold, about a bitterness toward his own inaction that had settled into him so completely he had stopped, some time back, expecting it ever to lift. She told him, in turn, of Iksu's stubborn pride in those same final weeks, of a husband too ashamed of his own wife's cooking to accept the one remedy that might have saved him, of burying a man behind a cabin with the valley's sympathy but never quite its acceptance, and of 3 winters spent making crocks nobody in Harlow Creek would openly thank her for, mostly, she admitted, because stopping felt like it would mean Iksu's stubbornness had won some argument she still intended to keep fighting on his behalf. Caleb said quietly that he did not think either of them had failed the people they had lost so much as they had both been failed first, by a valley too proud and too frightened of anything foreign to let a good remedy do its work in time for either death to have been prevented. And soon he found, standing beside him in the last of the autumn light, with her hand resting near his on the fence rail, without either of them quite deciding to put it there, that she believed him more completely than she had believed almost anyone in Harlow Creek in 6 long years. Neither of them said anything further for a while after that, the silence between them settling into something closer to shared ground than to grief. And when Caleb finally walked her back to her waiting horse, he held the gate for her. The way a man holds a door for someone he has already decided, quietly and without ceremony, that he intends to keep holding doors for. The trouble that would come to be remembered across Harlow Creek as the bad year announced itself first in a spring so wet that 3 separate root cellars along Coldwater Creek came up thick with mold before the last frost had even properly cleared, ruining potatoes and squash that families had been counting on to carry them through to the next harvest, and forcing more than one household to buy seed a second time at prices the general economy of a small cattle valley could not comfortably absorb. The wet spring gave way to a scorching midsummer that stunted what did manage to grow, and then, in the second week of September, a full month earlier than any frost anyone in the valley could remember, a hard, sudden freeze swept down off the mountains overnight and took what remained of the gardens in a single brutal blow, blackening leaves that had been green and hopeful the previous evening into something closer to ash by the following dawn. Reverend Cole preached a sermon that Sunday about providence and patience that satisfied almost no one in a congregation, already doing hard, worried arithmetic about how thin the winter ahead was going to run. And Dr. Elias Marsh, cornered after the service by 3 separate families, asking what a bad harvest might mean for the valley's health, come January, gave answers considerably more careful than confident, having watched the black winter 3 years back, closely enough to understand exactly what a thin harvest could eventually cost. A community too proud to plan around it properly. Sunhee worked her own claim harder that autumn than she had worked it in the 3 years since Iksu's death, salting and packing every cabbage and mustard green her diminished garden could produce, buying extra from what few farms still had surplus to spare, filling her cellar shelf by careful shelf with crocks she suspected, watching the blackened fields stretch out toward the mountains. The valley was going to need considerably more of than she alone could possibly supply. Caleb, riding the boundary of his own ranch in the thin, worried light of that same September, found himself doing an arithmetic of his own, counting winters back to the last time this valley's stores had failed this badly. And finding the number came out, with a coldness that settled in his chest and did not entirely leave it again that whole season, to exactly 3. By the second week of January, the thin harvest had done exactly what Dr. Marsh had feared it would do, and the first case to reach his examining table, wearing the unmistakable early signs of the sickness Harlow Creek still called, carefully, winter wasting, belonged to 7-year-old Clara Kessler, whose gums had begun bleeding at the smallest pressure of a toothbrush, and whose knees had swollen enough over a single week that she had stopped without complaint. The running and climbing her mother had never once in 7 years managed to slow down by ordinary scolding. Adeline Kessler sat in Dr. Marsh's office, holding her daughter's hand with a composure that cracked only once, briefly, when the doctor admitted, as gently as the admission allowed, that his tonics and his usual treatments had done little to slow the same sickness 3 winters before, and that the families who had come through that earlier bad season with their children strongest had, without exception as far as he could now recall, been the families quietly buying jars through the back door of Pruitt's Mercantile. Adeline did not ask, that first visit, exactly whose jars those had been, though she suspected, with a discomfort she was not yet ready to examine closely, that she already knew the answer better than she wanted to. Within a week, 3 more children across the valley had shown the same early signs, and Pruitt's small private stock, the quiet overflow Sun Hee had been supplying him for years without fanfare, sold out entirely inside of 4 days, leaving families desperate enough to ask outright for the first time in 3 years precisely whose Crocks those had always been and where more of them might be found before the sickness went any further than swollen knees and bleeding gums. Sun Hee heard the news of the run on Pruitt's shelf from Caleb himself, who rode out to tell her plainly rather than let her hear it secondhand. And she stood a long moment in her own cellar afterward, counting the Crocks she had left against a valley's worth of children she had spent 3 years being told, in every polite and impolite way Harlow Creek knew how to manage, that she did not properly belong to. The days that followed put Harlow Creek through a particular, ugly kind of arithmetic that nobody in the valley much cared to say aloud, weighing 3 years of careful social distance against a growing list of sick children whose parents had run entirely out of quieter remedies to try first. Some families swallowed the matter quickly and without much visible struggle, riding out to the reclaim within days of Clara Kessler's diagnosis to buy whatever Crocks Sun Hee had left at whatever price she named, grateful enough not to haggle over what had, until recently, been a purchase most of them preferred to make through a back door rather than a front gate. Others held out longer, Adeline Kessler chief among them, unable in the first raw week of Clara's illness to reconcile the idea of asking help from the very woman she had ordered, seated last at her own carefully arranged supper table, choosing instead to trust Dr. Marsh's tonics a while longer, even as Clara's fever climbed and her appetite for anything at all continued to fail. Warren Kessler, watching his daughter grow visibly weaker over a week, his wife spent still deciding whether pride could be afforded a while longer, finally rode to Pruitt's Mercantile himself, quietly, without telling Adeline, and returned with 2 of the last jars in the store, feeding them to Clara himself, spoonful by careful spoonful, while telling his wife only that the doctor had recommended a new tonic he'd managed to source from a traveling peddler, a small, protective lie he told without much visible guilt, and did not intend to correct any time soon. The lie held for 11 days, long enough for Clara's gums to stop bleeding and her appetite to begin returning, before Adeline, cleaning out a cupboard while her husband was out on the range, found an empty crock exactly like the ones she had once ordered seated last at her own table, and stood holding it in her own kitchen for a long, silent while, doing an arithmetic of her own that arrived this time at an answer she did not much care for. It was Reverend Cole, not Adeline Kessler, who finally rode out to the right claim to ask for help outright, arriving on a bitter February morning with his hat in his hands almost literally, and the particular humility of a man who had spent 3 years failing to notice a solution, sitting 3 miles from his own church door. He told Sun Hee plainly, without dressing the request in more comfortable language than it deserved, that Pruitt's shelf had run dry, that 6 more children across the valley had come down with the sickness in the past 10 days alone, and that whatever Crocks she had left, along with whatever more she was willing and able to make in the weeks ahead, Harlow Creek needed considerably more urgently now than it had ever admitted needing her presence at a supper table. Sun Hee listened to the whole of it without interrupting, standing in her own doorway with the cold February wind pulling at the edge of her shawl, and did not answer him immediately, weighing a request that arrived, she noted plainly to him, only after 3 winters of the valley, managing quite comfortably without her, and only now that its own children stood to suffer the consequence of that comfortable distance. She told him she needed time to consider it, a response that visibly unsettled a man accustomed to requests for help being met, in his experience, with immediate and grateful compliance. And she watched him ride back toward town with an expression she did not fully examine herself until well after he had gone. Some mixture of vindication and a grief so old it surprised her with how sharply it could still surface, given how carefully she had learned to carry it these past 3 years. She thought of Iksu that whole long evening, of a doctor's careless remark about barnyard smells and Christian tables, of a husband too proud and too frightened of his own neighbor's opinion to accept in time the very help his own wife had been offering him all along. And she understood, sitting alone at her table with the Reverend's request, weighing on her considerably more than she had let him see, that whatever answer she gave Harlow Creek now, she did not intend to give it quietly or on anybody's terms but her own. She rode into town herself 2 days later, a choice that startled half of Harlow Creek simply by its unannounced directness, and asked to see Reverend Cole in the church hall itself rather than at his own house, a location she had selected deliberately, and said so plainly the moment he arrived to meet her. She told him she would teach the method, all of it, salting and packing and the patient weeks of brine, to every woman in the valley willing to learn it, and that she would do it there, in that same church hall where the supper tables had once been set without a place for her, on a Sunday afternoon, with the doors open to anyone who cared to watch, as well as anyone who cared to learn. She told him, further, that she expected her own name spoken plainly over the lesson, rather than folded away the way it had been folded away, over 3 years of quiet purchases, through Pruitt's back door. Not from vanity, she said, watching his face carefully to see whether he understood the distinction she was drawing, but because a method that had saved her own life through 3 hard winters and might now save the valley's children deserved to be known for exactly what it was and exactly whose knowledge it had come from, rather than absorbed quietly into Harlow Creek's habits the way the valley had always preferred to absorb whatever it found useful about her, while pretending at every supper table that the rest of her did not exist. She would not, she added, be teaching this out of a back door, or a side gate, or any arrangement that let the valley keep pretending it had solved its own trouble without her. Reverend Cole, who had ridden out expecting gratitude, and had instead been handed a set of terms he had not anticipated needing to negotiate, sat with the request a long moment before agreeing to every part of it, recognizing with the particular clarity grief and fear tend to produce in even the most conflict-averse men, that he was in no position that winter to argue with the one person in the valley who actually held the knowledge his congregation's children needed to survive it. Word of the arrangement reached Adeline Kessler before the Reverend had even finished riding back to town, and she arrived at the parsonage within the hour, still holding the empty crock she had found in her own cupboard 3 days before, to object, at some length, and with considerably less of her usual composure than she generally allowed herself in public, to the idea of sitting in a church hall being taught anything by a woman she had spent 3 years actively excluding from her own table. Reverend Cole, unmoved in a way that surprised even himself after months of avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation, told her plainly that she was welcome to keep her pride and her tonics and stay home if she preferred, but that Clara's recovery over the past 11 days had come from precisely the source Adeline now found so difficult to sit across a room from. A fact he did not intend to let her forget for the sake of her comfort. Adeline left the parsonage without agreeing to anything, but she was seen, the following Sunday, seated in the very back row of the crowded church hall with Clara beside her, arriving late enough to avoid any greeting, and leaving, everyone noticed, considerably earlier than she needed to. Caleb had arrived earlier still, at the front of the hall rather than the back. Having ridden in specifically, he told anyone who asked to help Sunhee carry in the crocks and salt and cloth she needed for the demonstration, a task that required, by any reasonable estimate, considerably less of his direct assistance than the hours he ended up spending, arranging tables and holding jars steady while she worked. He said nothing at all about his own pew, empty now for going on 4 months, and nobody in the crowded hall that afternoon quite had the nerve to ask him about it directly. Watching instead as he settled into a chair near the front, close enough to Sunhee's demonstration table that the arrangement required no further explanation from either of them, and considerably closer to forgiveness, several of the older women present privately agreed afterward that either of them had likely intended to arrive that particular Sunday. Sunhee stood at the front of the same room where her crock had once sat untouched through an entire evening, a long table before her, lined with cabbage and mustard greens and the coarse salt she had carried in herself, and she began, without any particular ceremony, the same lesson her own mother had once given her in a kitchen half a world away, explaining the same patient sequence in front of 24 strangers that she had once explained to only one quiet, attentive rancher in her own cellar: the salting, the packing, the slow weeks a sealed crock needed to work its own transformation out of sight and out of argument, until what sat in front of them looked less like spoilage and more like the one thing standing between Harlow Creek's children and a repeat of the winter that had already taken too much from too many of its families. She walked the room as she spoke, correcting hands that packed the cabbage too loosely or salted it too thin, offering the same patient, unhurried instruction to Adeline Kessler that she offered every other woman seated at those long tables, drawing no visible distinction between the family that had bought from her quietly for years and the family that had, until 11 days before, refused to say her name aloud in its own kitchen. Adeline worked through the lesson mostly in silence, her hands moving carefully through motions Sun-hee demonstrated twice for her without being asked, and said nothing at all about the supper table, or the empty place setting, or the 3 winters of careful distance that had preceded this particular Sunday, though she stayed, everyone noted, considerably longer than her early departure the previous week had suggested she intended to. By the time the lesson ended, a full 24 Crocks stood packed and salted along the church hall's long tables, waiting out their first days of quiet fermentation in the very room where a single Crock had once waited. Unopened for an evening, it never got. The following Sunday, for the first time in 4 months, the Ashford pew at the front of the Harlow Creek Church held a single occupant through the entire service. And though nobody in the congregation troubled Caleb with questions about what exactly had brought him back, more than one of them noticed that his eyes, through most of the sermon, kept drifting 3 rows back toward a woman who had, until recently, never once been permitted to sit that close to the front. The weeks that followed carried a particular, anxious rhythm through Harlow Creek that the valley had not felt since the Black Winter itself. Every household with a new crock, now counting the days toward the 3-week mark, the way farmers elsewhere counted days toward a harvest, checking their cellars each morning for the telltale bubble along the brine surface that Sun-hee had told them meant the process was working as it should. She rode a circuit of the valley twice that month, visiting every family who had attended the church hall lesson, correcting a crock gone too warm here, a brine gone too thin there, answering the same nervous questions in a dozen different kitchens, with a patience that surprised more than one household, into a warmth toward her they had not previously extended and did not now know quite how to express. Clara Kessler's recovery, already well underway before the lesson, continued steadily through those weeks, her color returning fully by the first week of March, her running and climbing resuming with an energy her mother watched from the porch with an expression considerably softer than the composed reserve Adeline had maintained through most of the preceding winter. 2 more children, further out along the valley's eastern edge, showed early signs of the sickness in late February, and their families, rather than waiting the way earlier households had waited, rode directly to the reclaim within the day, a shift in Harlow Creek's instincts that Sun-hee noted quietly to herself, without remarking on it to anyone, understanding better than most exactly how much that particular change had cost the valley's pride to manage. Caleb rode the circuit alongside her most days that month, carrying crocks and mending the odd fence along the way with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to every task he took on, and the 2 of them fell, without either one formally arranging it, into a rhythm of shared work that neither Harlow Creek's earlier gossip nor its earlier disapproval seemed any longer inclined to comment on, the valley having apparently decided, somewhere in the space of a single hard month, that it had considerably more urgent matters to attend to than who rode beside whom along the Coldwater Creek Road. By the middle of March, Dr. Marsh could report, for the first time in a difficult season, that not a single new case of winter wasting had appeared across the valley in over 3 weeks, and that the 6 children already diagnosed that winter were, without exception, recovering steadily on a diet that included, alongside his own tonics, the same fermented greens he had once dismissed, in his own private notes, as an unproven folk remedy unlikely to withstand serious medical scrutiny. He rode out to the reclaim himself in the last week of March, a visit that surprised Sun-hee considerably more than the Reverend's earlier one had, and asked her, with the careful, slightly embarrassed thoroughness of a man revising a long-held professional opinion in real time, to walk him through the method in full so that he might understand, for his own records and for whatever use future winters demanded of him, exactly what it was that had succeeded where his own training had fallen short. She answered every question he asked with the same unhurried patience she had extended the whole valley that month, and found, watching him take careful notes in a leather notebook he had clearly not expected to need that afternoon, a particular satisfaction in watching a man who had once dismissed her husband's death as an unfortunate case of stubbornness sit at her own table, taking her seriously at last. Word of the doctor's visit spread through Harlow Creek nearly as fast as word of the church supper had spread 3 winters before, though this time the story carried in a considerably warmer direction, several families remarking to one another, within earshot of people who would once have agreed readily that the valley owed the Ree widow rather more than it had ever properly acknowledged, a sentiment that reached Sun Hee secondhand, through Pruitt and through Caleb both, with a frequency that told her something real had shifted in Harlow Creek's collective memory of that hard winter, even if nobody yet seemed entirely sure how to say so to her face. Adeline Kessler rode out to the Ray claim alone on a mild afternoon in early April, without her husband, and without any of the usual social errands the Valley's women generally invented, as cover for a visit they weren't quite ready to name outright, and stood at Sun Hee's gate for a long moment before finally coming up the path. Carrying a covered basket, she sat down on the porch step, with considerably less confidence than she generally brought to anything she did in Harlow Creek. She did not apologize in any of the words Sun Hee might once have imagined wanting to hear, offering instead, haltingly, an account of Clara's recovery and a quiet acknowledgement that she had been wrong about a great many things over the past 3 years, an admission that visibly cost her more than the ride-out had, and that she delivered without quite managing to meet Sun Hee's eyes throughout most of it. The basket held preserves of her own, an apple butter she had put up the previous autumn from her own family's small orchard, offered less as an even exchange than as the only gesture Adeline seemed to know how to make of the particular debt she had come to settle, and soon he accepted it with a quiet grace that asked nothing further of a woman plainly still working out how much further she was capable of going. Adeline told her, before she left, that she intended to see a proper place set for her at every supper the church hosted from that season forward, a promise Sun Hee received without visible triumph, understanding it for what it was, a first repair rather than a complete one, offered by a woman who had needed her own child's illness to arrive at an apology 3 winters of quiet neighborliness had never once managed to produce on their own. It was not, Sun Hee thought, watching Adeline ride back toward town, the reckoning she might once have wanted, but it was, she decided, turning the jar of apple butter over in her own hands, a considerably more honest one than most of Harlow Creek had ever managed to offer her before. The change moved through Harlow Creek slowly across the rest of that spring, in the particular, half-embarrassed way small communities shift when they have been shown plainly and publicly exactly how they misjudge someone, arriving not as any single dramatic reversal, but as a long accumulation of small corrections that added up by early May to something Sun Hee could feel every time she rode into town. Pruitt stopped keeping her jars behind the counter entirely, moving them out onto the same open shelves that held his vinegar pickles and his tinned peaches, with her name written plainly on a small card propped against the row, a gesture he made without comment one Tuesday morning, and never once explained to anyone who asked, including Sun Hee herself, who noticed it the very next time she came in for salt and said nothing about it either, understanding a man like Pruitt well enough by then to know the shelf spoke for him considerably better than words would have. Women who had once offered her careful, distant politeness now stopped her outright at the mercantile to ask after a batch that had turned too sour, or a brine that seemed cloudier than it should. Questions she answered patiently every time, having decided somewhere in the hard weeks of that winter that there was more use to the Valley's new willingness to learn than there was satisfaction in nursing 3 years of old resentment against the slowness with which that willingness had finally arrived. She still thought of Iksu often in those months, of a table he had been too proud to accept help at until pride had cost him everything. And she found a particular, complicated comfort in watching Harlow Creek learn, however belatedly, the lesson her own husband had never managed to learn in time, that a person's dignity was not actually diminished by accepting a remedy simply because of where it had come from. Caleb, riding beside her on most of those trips into town, now, without either of them troubling to invent an excuse for it any longer, told her once, watching Pruitt's small hand-lettered card from across the street, that he thought the Valley had finally started setting the table the way it always should have, a remark she received with a quiet laugh that had, by that point in the spring, become considerably easier for her to reach than it had once been. He asked her properly on an evening in late May, sitting together on the porch step of her own cabin, with the worn creek stone that had once waited a crock at her gate, now resting between them the way it had rested there, unremarked upon for the better part of a year, both of them having quietly agreed some time back to keep it exactly where it had first landed, rather than move it anywhere more sensible. He told her, without any of the careful indirection that had governed nearly everything he'd done since first leaving that crock at her gatepost, that he did not intend to spend whatever years remained to him riding out to this claim on invented errands about fences that never actually needed mending, and asked her plainly whether she would consider building a life alongside his instead of merely 3 miles across the valley from it. She did not answer immediately, turning the creek stone over once in her own hands the way she had turned over so many other things that had passed between them that year, before telling him that she would, provided he understood, she came to any such arrangement now, as a woman the whole valley had finally learned to set a place for, and that she did not intend to let either of them forget, in whatever years followed, exactly how long and how hard that particular lesson had taken Harlow Creek to learn. Caleb said he did not think either of them was likely to forget it, having both spent considerably longer than either wanted holding an empty place at their own tables long before this particular spring had finally filled them, and he told her, quiet and certain in the fading porch light, that he intended to spend the rest of his own life making sure her place at any table he sat at was never once in question again. She leaned into him then, the first time either of them had allowed themselves quite that much certainty in front of the other, and the two of them sat together a long while as the light went from gold to gray to a soft, settled dark over Coldwater Creek, saying very little else that evening, because by that point, very little else needed saying. The next church supper, held in early June under a sky considerably kinder than the one that had presided over the last, saw the long trestle tables behind the Harlow Creek Church, dressed once again with the valley's best linen and its good china, and this time a place had been laid at the center of the first table, not at its farthest, quietest edge, set with a folded napkin and a fork laid crosswise exactly the way every other family's place had always been set, waiting for Sun-Hee Rhee before she had even come up the path. Reverend Cole opened the meal that evening with a prayer that departed for once from his usual careful neutrality, thanking Providence plainly for a hard winter's lesson and for the particular knowledge that had carried the valley's children through it, a thanks he directed, without hedging or vagueness, toward the woman now seated at the center of his own church hall's supper table for the first time in the 4 years she had lived within riding distance of it. Adeline Kessler, seated 2 places down with Clara beside her, added her own crock to the spread that evening, salted and packed by her own hand under instruction she had received in that same hall 3 months before, and set it down beside Sun-Hee's without any of the careful distance the 2 women's dishes had once required, an arrangement neither of them commented on directly, but both of them understood completely. Sun-Hee ate that supper, surrounded for the first time since her own wedding, by a table that had not merely tolerated her presence, but had actively made room for it, Caleb beside her, with his hand resting easy over hers on the tablecloth. And she found herself thinking, watching the whole valley pass dishes back and forth, across a table finally free of the careful hierarchies that had once governed every plate on it, of Iksu, and of a table he had never lived to see, and of a particular satisfaction in knowing that whatever else that hard winter had cost Harlow Creek, it had also finally taught the valley the one lesson her husband's death had never quite managed to teach it in time. By the following autumn, the lesson Sun-Hee had first taught in a crowded church hall had become, without anyone in Harlow Creek formally deciding to make it so, an annual fixture of the valley's calendar, a full Sunday set aside each September, when families gathered at the church hall with their own cabbage and mustard greens and coarse salt to pack the crocks that would carry them through whatever winter came next. Taught now not only by Sun-Hee herself, but by a rotating handful of the women who had learned from her that first hard season and had since become, in their own smaller ways, teachers of the method themselves. Clara Kessler, 8 years old and fully recovered, sat at the front of that gathering each year with a child's serious concentration, packing her own small crock under Sun-Hee's patient instruction the same way 24 other children in the valley now did. Growing up with a comfortable, unremarkable familiarity toward a tradition their parents had once needed a crisis to accept, Caleb kept the small pair of boots on their shelf above his own saddle, still not out of grief alone any longer, but as a plain, steady reminder of exactly what a valley's pride could cost when it went unchecked too long. a reminder he found himself passing on, gently to his and Sun-hee's own children in the years that followed, teaching them the particular difference between a table with an empty place at it and one that had learned, finally and for good, how to fill every place it set. Sun-hee, standing at the front of the church hall each September, watching a new generation of Harlow Creek learn a method her own mother had first taught her in a kitchen half a world away, found that the old shame she had once carried over her own foreignness had transformed, given enough seasons and enough patient teaching, into something considerably closer to a legacy. One measured not in the land she had once fought to hold, but in every crock now standing, salted and packed and quietly working, in cellars up and down the whole of Coldwater Creek. The old clay crock that had once sat untouched through an entire church supper still sits today on a shelf inside the Harlow Creek Church Hall, cracked now along one side from years of handling and empty of everything but the memory of what it once held, kept there at Reverend Cole's own insistence as a plain reminder to every new family passing through Harlow Creek of exactly how close the valley once came to losing children it could have saved years sooner if pride alone had not stood so stubbornly in the way. Sun-hee kept the creek stone from her own gatepost too, worn smoother now by years of handling, set on a windowsill in the house she and Caleb built together, within sight of both Coldwater Creek and the small fenced plot where Toby's marker still stood, tended now by a family considerably larger and considerably less alone than the two of them had been the winter they first met across an untouched crock and an empty pew. If there is a single thing worth carrying forward from Sun-hee Ree's long, quiet fight for a place at her own table, it is that the people who decide, in a single unkind moment, that someone does not belong among them are very rarely the ones who end up deciding, in the end, what that person is actually worth to the place they call home. And that dignity earned through hard, patient work outlasts every empty place setting built to convince a person she does not deserve one. So tell me in the comments which part of her story stayed with you the longest, whether it was the crock left standing untouched at a table with no place for her, or the church hall finally filled with women learning at her own hands. And if you want more stories like Sun-hee and Caleb's, make sure you subscribe, because there are more women out there like her, whose place at the table was always rightfully theirs, long before anyone else in the room was finally willing to admit it.